The United Nations Commission on the Status of Women works to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women. An important job, and that's a mild understatement. And now, in a move that many find difficult to believe, Saudi Arabia has been elected to the commission. A secret vote added the Gulf nation, which does not have a good reputation when it comes to women's rights, to the 45-member committee. Let's have a listen to exactly what happened there yesterday.
Having obtained the necessary majority, I declare elected from the Asia-Pacific states, Iraq, Republic of Korea, Japan, Turkmenistan, Saudi Arabia, to the Commission on the Status of Women for a 4-year term beginning at the first meeting to be held in 2018.
Now, joining me in studio to talk about this very surprising development, Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of the human rights NGO UN Watch. Mr. Neuer, good morning to you. Can you explain to me how Saudi Arabia becomes somebody who's in charge of women's rights in the UN?
Well, look, it's absolutely absurd, and it's morally reprehensible. As you mentioned, this is a United Nations body that is dedicated to the empowerment of women, to gender equality, and they've just promoted the worst regime in the world when it comes to women's rights to be a guardian of these women's rights.
That. What are the rights of women in Saudi Arabia?
Well, there are no rights of women in Saudi Arabia. Women in Saudi Arabia are obliged from the moment they're born until their death to have a male guardian, whether it's a husband, father, or a son, to sign off on any of their movements, whether in the country or outside the country. Women in Saudi Arabia do not have the right to drive a car. Women in Saudi Arabia are arrested if they go outside without wearing a black cloak, the abaya. They are subjugated, and the fact that they would be put as guardians of women's rights is despicable.
How does something like this happen then?
Well, sadly, the United Nations does not follow its own principles. For example, the Human Rights Council, countries are supposed to be elected according to their record on human rights. The reality we know, we found access to Saudi documents that were published by WikiLeaks, where the Saudi ambassador wrote a letter to the Russian ambassador, said, let's do a, quote, reciprocal agreement of support. We'll vote for you, the Russians, Vladimir Putin, on the Human Rights Council, and you, Vladimir Putin, will vote for Saudi Arabia on the Human Rights Council. And that's why just a few months ago, Saudi Arabia was also elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council. So what we're talking about are petrodollars are trumping principles and are trumping human rights.
The phrase "petrodollars are trumping human rights" is one that, you know, can resonate very strongly in this day and age in 2017. So let's say, you know, reporting according to WikiLeaks and whatnot, Saudi Arabia now, as part of that council, what can it decide on?
Well, it's a body that makes decisions on women's rights, and it is supposed to speak out for gender equality. It doesn't necessarily have an immediate impact, but I think we're talking about a symbol and a message, and the message that the United Nations sends to Saudi women in particular, forget about women around the world, but right. Saudi women's rights activists, when they saw our report on social media, have been reacting and saying that this is demoralizing to them. What a betrayal. You know, that was the word that came out, is that the United Nations has betrayed Saudi women's rights activists by putting their oppressor in a position of power and influence when it comes to women's rights. And that's why I said that electing Saudi Arabia to a women's rights body is like making a pyromaniac into a fire chief.
Or someone may argue even it's like making the rapists in charge of their victims. And in that respect, and I'm wondering with you, Hillel, what is the point, and if deals as such do happen, as what you described, if that is indeed the case, Russia versus, you know, Syria, Russia versus
trading votes.
Trading votes, then what's the point of the United Nations?
Well, the United Nations has principles that we respect and believe in.
I mean, especially in a day like today.
And we need to hold the United Nations accountable. Today is Holocaust Day in Israel, and the UN Secretary General Guterres made a very good speech the other day against anti-Israel prejudice, against anti-Semitism. Our group is holding them to account. We have UNRWA, the UN Relief Agency on Palestinians. Hundreds of teachers post on their social media accounts every day pictures of Hitler, pictures of Hamas terrorists, call to murder Jews. The United Nations has to show that they're putting their money where their mouth is. And if the UN chief is fighting anti-Semitism, we ask, will you fire one teacher who posts pictures of Hitler on his Facebook page, as we would do in our own education systems in Canada, in England?
I'm back, or possibly just protect the rights of Saudi women. As one point as well. Hillel, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. When we get back,